Should we get started?
So I want to welcome everyone to this virtual Bookwoman event. Bookwoman is one of the few remaining historically feminist bookstores where we've been feisty feminists and booksellers for now 45 years. So thank you all for joining us. And today our program is Melissa Febos and Jordan Shapiro. And Melissa wrote Girlhood, and Jordan's book Father Figure is just out. And should I introduce both of you or one at a time? We didn't actually discuss that. Like, how do we want to?
I think both would be fine. We can just get it out of the way and then we'll take it.
And then you could say, take it away. So, Melissa Febos is the author of the memoir Whip Smart and two essay collections, Abandon Me, a LAMBDA Literary Award finalist and a Publishing Triangle Award finalist, and Girlhood, now a national bestseller, which was released on March 30th. Catapult will publish a collection of her craft essays, Body Works, in 2022. The inaugural winner of the Jeanne Córdova Nonfiction Award from LAMBDA Literary and the recipient of fellowships from the MacDowell Colony, Loaf, Lower Manhattan Deming Foundation, Cultural Council, the BAU Institute, Vermont Studio Center, the Barbara Deming Foundation, and others. Her essays have appeared in the Paris Review, The Believer, McSweeney's, Granta, Sewanee Review, Tin House, The Sun, and of course, the New York Times. She is now the associate professor at the University of Iowa, where she teaches in the Nonfiction Writing Program. And Jordan Shapiro is the father of two children and a stepfather to two more. He lives in Philadelphia with his partner, Amanda, who's helping with the broadcast. Thank you, Amanda. He teaches in Temple University's Intellectual Heritage Program. He's senior fellow for the Joan Gantz Cooney Center at Sesame Workshop and non-resident fellow in the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institute. His book, The New Childhood, 2018, received wide critical acclaim from most places and has been published in 11 languages. His new book, Father Figure, How to Be a Feminist Dad, offers a norm-shattering perspective on fatherhood, family, and gender essentialism. This thoughtful exploration of dad psychology presented from an archetypical perspective challenges our familiar assumptions about the origins of the so-called traditional parenting roles. And so, wow, both of you all, thank you so much. Great work. And I know we're going to look forward to a great conversation. We're going to do a little bit of Q&A afterwards. And so should we put that in the chat, or is there a Q&A? Sometimes there's a separate Q&A component.
I think there's a Q&A. Oh, Amanda's telling us the chat. So go ahead and everybody throw it in the chat. And my suggestion is, as soon as you have a question, just put it there. We'll also monitor the Q&A function if you want to put it there, but I always forget my questions right away if I don't ask them. So feel free to type them and then we'll circle back.
And then we'll go back. And so the format will be, each one will read a little bit and then we'll do the Q&A. And who's going first?
We didn't talk about that.
Yeah.
I feel like your book just came out, so you're the headliner. So why don't I go first? And then we'll segue through you into our conversation. How does that sound?
That's fine, but your writing's so good that I'm afraid that mine's going to look pale after yours. But I guess yours.
Well, I've read your book, so I'm not worried about that. So I'm going to ignore you. How's that? Okay, I'm going to read a little bit from the first essay in my collection. It's called Kettle Holes. Let's see. Okay, here we go. When I turned 11, I enrolled in the public middle school with all the other 5th and 6th graders in our town. The new bus stop was farther down the wooded road where it ended at the perpendicular intersection of another. On that corner was a large house owned by Robert Ballard, the oceanographer who discovered the wreck of the Titanic in 1985. Early in his career, Ballard had worked with the nearby Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and it was during his deep sea dives off the coast of Massachusetts that his obsession with shipwrecks was born. Sometimes I studied that house, its many gleaming windows and ivy-choked tennis court, and thought about the difference between Ballard and my father, who was a captain in the Merchant Marines. One man carried his cargo across oceans, the other ventured deep inside them to discover his. I was drawn to the romance of each, to slice across the glittering surface and also to plunge into the cold depths. A stone wall wrapped around Ballard's yard. Here we waited for the school bus. I read books as I walked to the bus stop. Reading ate time. Whole hours disappeared in stretches. It shortened the length of my father's voyages, moved me closer to his returns with every page. I was a magician with a single power: to disappear the world. I emerged from whole afternoons of reading, my life a foggy half dream through which I drifted as myself bled back into me like steeping tea. The start of 5th grade marked more change than the location of my bus stop. My parents had separated that summer. My body, that once reliable vessel, began to transform. But what emerged from it was no happy magic, no abracadabra. It went kaboom. The new body was harder to disappear. I wish people didn't change sometimes, I wrote in my diary. By people, I meant my parents. I meant me. Before puberty, I moved through the world and toward other people without hesitance or self-consciousness. I read hungrily and kept lists of all the words I wanted to look up in a notebook with a red velvet cover. I still have the notebook. Ersatz, it reads, entropy, mnemonic, morass, corpulent, hoary. I was smart and strong, and my power lay in these things alone. My parents loved me well and mirrored these strengths back to me. Perhaps more so than other girls, my early world was a safe one. My mother banned cable TV and sugar cereals and made feminist corrections to my children's books with a Sharpie. When he was home from sea, my father taught me how to throw a baseball and a punch, how to find the North Star and start a fire. I was protected from the darker leagues of what it meant to be female. I think now of the Titanic, not the familiar tragedy of its wreck, the scream of ice against her starboard flank, the thunder of seawater gushing through her cracked hull. I think of the short miracle of her passage, the 375 miles she floated, immaculate, across the Atlantic. My early passage was a miracle too, and like the Titanic's, it did not last. My mother noticed first. Your body is a temple, she told me, but the bra she bought me felt more straitjacket than vestment. I wore baggy t-shirts and hunched my shoulders. I tried to bury my body. It was too big in all the wrong ways. My hips went purple from crashing them into table corners. I no longer knew my own shape. My mother brought home a book called the What's Happening to My Body book for girls. It explained hormonal shifts, the science of breasts and pubic hair. It was not the What's Happening to the World as I Knew It book for girls, and it did not explain why being the only girl on the baseball team no longer felt like a triumph. It did not explain why grown men in passing cars, to whom I had always been happily invisible, now leered at me. It did not explain why or even acknowledge that what was happening to my body changed my value in the world. I did not ask about these other changes. Maybe some children do. But what if I asked and my parents did not have answers? It already seemed a risk to reveal myself. If the changes I felt were not indexed in the book they gave me, perhaps they were mine alone. Children know so little of the world. Every new thing might be our own creation. If a logic is not given, we invent one. How would my mother have explained it to me at 10? I can't imagine. And I'll stop there. Thanks so much for listening. You're muted, Jordan.
I'm going to read from a section from the first chapter of Father Figure, a section called Be the Breadwinner. When my oldest son was born, I celebrated with a shot of bourbon. At home that first week, I held him in my arms while listening to the entire catalog of Beatles songs in chronological order. We started with I Saw Her Standing There on Please Please Me and finished with Get Back on Let It Be. I sang every lyric to him, off key, but with conviction. My son was a mini-me, and even before it was developmentally appropriate, I wanted to share a legacy of entertainment, hobbies, interests, movies, and music. His mother suffered minor health complications and needed some extra time in bed to rest. So I took the baby around the corner to his first visit with the pediatrician. When she stepped into the room, it was clear that she was uneasy with my then wife's absence. Before even beginning the examination, the doctor suggested that the baby wasn't eating enough. It was as if the lack of a mother's breast at that moment constituted sufficient evidence of malnourishment. I made a mental note of the pediatrician's narrow-mindedness, her commitment to a fictional narrative about the sanctity and necessity of maternal caretaking. The notion of a metaphysical mother-infant bond preemptively discourages the efforts of well-meaning fathers. Plus, it's been used to legitimize gender inequality, to oppress women, and to limit their freedom. Bell Hooks writes, it's very telling that in the wake of feminist movement, the patriarchal medical establishment, which had previously downplayed breastfeeding, suddenly began to be not only positive about breastfeeding, but insistent. The pressure on mothers to breastfeed is so obviously out of proportion with the scientific evidence pointing to its benefits over formula where clean water is available, that it can only be understood as a move to place more child-rearing responsibility on women. But at the time, I was too focused, excited, and anxious about being a new father to let the doctor's bias bother me. During those first few weeks, I loved being with my newborn son. It was the early days of e-commerce, and I ordered a baby wrap online. The large, colorful swath of earth green organic cotton twill fabric was marketed as an ancient and essential child-rearing tool, a pivotal object in the evolution of human civilization, an iconic artifact of pure attachment parenting. What luck that it had been adapted and manufactured for modern times. It was complicated to don, but very comfortable once you got the folds, drapes, and knots just right. I strapped my son to my chest and headed out to buy groceries and diapers at Target. My son was going to enjoy all the benefits of nurturing touch, and I felt a kinship with my hunter-gatherer ancestors. It was like I was part of the primal lineage of human father figures, harvesting essential sustenance for our family. Soon there was even more gear. A wealthy relative gifted us an overpriced modular car seat stroller. It was called the Frog, or the Salamander, or some other amphibian species. Presumably, it was branded that way because it was a hybrid, engineered so it could adapt to multiple environments. Maybe it was also supposed to hint at some reptilian brain origin story. So much of the marketing aimed at new parents features a paradoxical blend of techno-utopian pseudo-Darwinism. We want a fully medicalized and scientifically endorsed version of child development, but we want it to feel primitive and natural. We're even happy to ignore the archaic narratives of gender, provided they make us feel like we're raising our kids with the wisdom of our ancient ancestors. Anyway, I learned to transform the over-engineered stroller contraption into a pram, and I pushed my son on walks around the neighborhood. Of course, people stopped along the sidewalk to admire the cute and adorable newborn. I quickly noticed the question that came up over and over again: where's his mother? It was almost like a series of billboards beside the highway, 3 miles up ahead, exit here, turn now. Were people trying to tell me that my commitment to fatherhood conflicted with the predominant cultural understanding of mature manhood? Was I supposed to conform with the popular perception or to resist it? Was there any place for me to find the kind of validation that I needed to stay motivated on my journey to become an involved feminist dad? Maybe not. Perhaps it was time to pull off the road. 53% of Americans say that breastfeeding aside, mothers do a better job than fathers at caring for a new baby. 45% say that mothers and fathers do it equally well. Only 1% say that fathers do it better. Folks just assume that biological sex determines one's competence at caretaking, making little allowance for variations among individuals. But there's no data or scientific evidence to support these conclusions. They're based on faith and misconceptions. Today's young dads tend to be enthusiastic parents, but only 39% believe they're doing a very good job raising their kids. Compare that with 51% of mothers. In 2016, dads spent triple the number of hours per week involved in childcare as fathers did in 1965. They also accounted for 17% of all stay-at-home parents, up from 10% 3 decades earlier, but still they're not satisfied. A 2017 survey found that 63% of fathers feel like they don't spend enough time with their children. They cite work obligations as the primary obstacle. There's fierce pressure to conform with the societal expectation that men be hardworking and persistent breadwinners. That's the way we're taught to establish our father figure credentials. We should work weekends and overtime, ruthlessly pursuing wealth and status to demonstrate our commitment to family. I know this persona well. I've played this part before. When my second son was born, I was 30 years old. I owned and operated a high-volume diner located in Philadelphia's famous Reading Terminal Market. I worked 6 days a week, long hours, managing staff, ordering food, tracking inventory, and filling in wherever I was needed. Every Saturday and Sunday morning, waking up before dawn, I cracked about 90 dozen eggs to order, making omelets, flipping them over easy, and plating them with a side of thick bacon and hand-cut home fries. I was great at my job, and I made a lot of money, but I was a terrible husband and not a very good person. At work, I hired people who had just returned from prison. They were living in halfway houses. I felt like I was helping them, but if I'm being honest, it was mostly because their labor was cheap and they always showed up on time, a requirement of parole. I also sometimes spoke inappropriately to the female employees, blindly reproducing the sexism, misogyny, and locker room gender essentialism I had witnessed during years of working in restaurant kitchens. Worse still, I engaged in regrettable sexual infidelities, perhaps because it made me feel like an alpha male. It was remarkable how many of my own bad behaviors I could pardon and excuse with the phrase, "It's just business." Eventually, it all caught up with me. In the weeks following my younger son's birth, I found myself in the early days of what would eventually become a long, devastating, depressive episode. Looking into my son's eyes forced me to confront difficult questions about what it means to be a good father and a good man. Was my life organized in a way that modeled the kind of maturity I wanted my children to emulate? How could I tell them to live a life that prioritized positive values and beliefs about equality, dignity, and justice if I prioritized profit, power, and pleasure so highly that I could easily overlook unethical choices as long as I was providing for my family? The cognitive dissonance broke me. I closed up completely. I stopped talking to most of my loved ones. I cried every day, usually in the mornings, before work, while drinking coffee and staring absent-mindedly through the kitchen window. I'd love to describe how it felt, but I was mostly numb. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Jordan. I just want to start off by saying that, I got your book a couple weeks ago and I've been reading it, and it has come into so many conversations that I've had with friends and other writers, and it's just I feel totally sort of blown away by how much I hadn't realized that I think we need a book like this. And also, I've been on a book tour reading about my adolescence and childhood, and one of the most common interactions I've been having, and one that I consistently have with men through sort of interviews, at readings, and casual conversation, I have so many dads coming to me and saying, "What do I do? How do I do it correctly? Help me." And I feel like, I don't know. I did a deep dive into my own experiences as a child and growing up and how that's important. Like, I have some theories kind of, but it has really made such a deep impression on me of sort of the dearth of resources that fathers have. And as I've been reading your book, I think, oh my God, this is like, I've been reading, feminist thinkers and sort of looking into ways to sort of transform myself and undo my own sort of patriarchal conditioning. And then I have like my anti-racism work, and I just have had almost no interaction with texts or resources like this that are approaching sort of parenthood and specifically fatherhood. So I just want to thank you for writing this book. I want to buy it for every dad that I know. And I've recommended it to so many people just in the last 2 weeks. So congratulations and thank you.
Thank you for saying all that. That's really kind. I mean, I have I had a similar response to reading your book. I mean, and I think I should say for everyone who's watching, you and I don't know each other. We talked once to plan this. We've emailed a couple times to plan this event, and the way this event came to be was I read your book and was so blown away by it that I reached out to you and said, you know, I think there's a lot we could talk about that would connect. And in some ways, I think that our books, there's almost a companionship that works well with them, because I think I kind of wish your book had been written when I was writing it, because I think it would have I would have added some things in, because I think in some ways you make not directly, not explicitly, but an argument for the almost child development argument for feminist parenting, because you give a window into what young people are going through in a patriarchal context, and you realize just how harmful that is. And then the only other thing I want to say, because you were talking about recommending it to fathers, is I keep recommending your book to fathers, but then I always hesitate because, especially fathers of daughters, and I always hesitate because I think they're going to think I'm trying to give them a book to help them protect their daughters, when really I'm like, I want you to read this because I want you to realize how you're hurting your daughters, and so I don't know. I always feel like I have to go. But wait, I'm not telling you to read it so you can think about the sexual lives of your daughter. That's not that's not the concern here. The concern is the ways that patriarchal parenting culture and all this is just making. I mean, we'll talk about so much of this, I'm sure tonight. But is really making everyone suffer. You know, your book is obviously about that suffering in girlhood, but it's also suffering for boyhood and for gender nonconforming childhood.
Yeah, and you really touched on that when I was listening to your reading, and of course I've read that passage, but it just feels like such a lucid and moving articulation of how patriarchy harms men, and all of how we are all sort of in bondage to these ideas, and it just is degrading everyone's sense of self and alienating ourselves from our own feelings, from our true desires, from a more integrated self, and a more sort of intimate and engaged parenthood. And I really do think that like the books work together as a really good, because I actually am like, well, it would be great for fathers to read my book if they read it in conjunction with your book, because your book is like the answer to my book, you know, where it's not about protecting or enforcing or like, you know, all of those sort of harmful sort of archetypal fatherhood scripts that you write about in this book. Like, that's not the answer to sort of my experience. It's really this kind of exactly what you outline. And I just want to speak to the book a little bit as a writer and someone who is really interested in sort of intertextuality and using personal narrative, research, ideology, intimacy, citation, a little bit of journalism. Like, your book really sort of marries these modes beautifully. And I was so impressed by your use of research and citation. And it's a really clear, direct, articulate read. And it's a pleasure to read. And I know how hard it is to distill all of those elements, particularly the ideological ones, into this kind of like clear, straightforward, boiled down prose that can be accessible to someone who doesn't have an academic background, who hasn't read psychology, or who hasn't even been in therapy. You know, like you really nailed it. And I know that it's like a very small bullseye with that kind of work. So I kind of wanted to hear you talk a little bit about the genesis of the book and sort of how you moved through the writing and thinking of it. I know that it must be sort of, you know, for me, writing is very much a thinking process. And so I'm sure you were sort of figuring stuff out as you were working, but if you could talk a little bit, especially for folks who haven't read the book, about what the genesis of it was, sort of how it got started and what your process looked a little bit like.
Yeah, sure. I mean, first of all, I'll start with I'll start at the beginning. It was when I was promoting my previous book, which was The New Childhood, and it became clear to me that there was really, well, I mean, one, there was a stigma against divorced dads, right? You couldn't possibly be a good dad if you were a divorced dad. That was, you know, people just made that assumption from the start, and that got me really interested in what's at the core of what we imagine to be a good dad. It made me want to ask those questions. But then there was another piece which I think gets to the stylistic piece that you're bringing up, which is that all of my writing is very personal, maybe even confessional, at least some level of memoir in it. And that's not how we expect to hear from a so-called male expert, right? In parenting books, it's totally normal to have a mom that writes from a place of intuition and experience, but dads are only supposed, you know, men are only supposed to be the experts if they create this very authoritative boundary, you know, like the psychologist who's not allowed to tell you anything about his personal life. And so there was almost a level of I didn't fit the mold of what people thought a father should be, and that really made me go, whoa, this needs to get unpacked, and this means having to look at it. The process was excruciatingly difficult, terrifyingly difficult. I mean, writing is hard. Writing is a really hard thing to do. Everything that you just said about where you think it works, I think to achieve that was certainly hard, but also didn't want to wanted, you know, to be a man, right? Trying to write a book about feminism, there was a really hard, careful line I felt like I had to walk to make sure, and I don't mean that just in terms of, you know, I didn't want to do the virtue signaling. Of course I didn't want to do all of that, right? I certainly didn't want this to be another one of those, you know, I call them the hold my balls while I cry men's books, right? about you know, it's so hard to be a man because I can't talk about my feelings, right, even though I can do anything I want, but I can't. I mean, I'm being a little bit, I jest a tiny bit, it's true. But I also, so much of our language and so much of our rhetorical conventions are inherently patriarchal, and so to try to, you know, how do you tell someone how to be more feminist while being a man without being an authority, which would mean you're not being more feminist. So that was a very, very, very difficult challenge that took many drafts, and many drafts that came back from the editor. I mean, there's a point in the acknowledgements where I joke that my editor was sometimes, I thanked her for her patience and sometimes impatience, because there were times where I felt like we were butting heads, where she just didn't understand what I was trying to get, which meant, and as a writer, you know, if the editor doesn't understand what you're trying to get, it means you didn't do it well. It doesn't mean there's something, they did it wrong. So there was a lot to deal with that, and it was really a difficult process. And then you know, we can get into this. I don't want to. Maybe we'll get into this as we keep talking. There was so much about myself that I had to look at and own up to, and just acknowledge wrongdoing, acknowledge mistakes, right?Ing willing to go, this is not the story, the way I've been telling it to myself is not accurate. I mean, actually, I'm going to bring it back to your book here with this point, because that was one of the things that I felt reading Girlhood, which was first really, again, excruciating, because as I read through Girlhood and got to the end, this, to use your words, right, this notion of how much accommodation and empty consent is involved in heterosexual relationships. I assume in all relationships, but certainly under patriarchy in heterosexual cisgender relationships. And as I went through so many of your examples, I saw times in my life where I just had to completely recontextualize that. And you know, just to give a sense of how that means, I had to go back through almost every sexual relationship of my whole life and go, wait, maybe I wasn't desired, right? Maybe I wasn't as attractive as I imagined myself to be. And that was hard, liberating in some ways, painful in the sense of having to confront those mistakes, but also like that's part of why I'm so grateful for Girlhood, because it allowed me to see that, right? Like I didn't even see that in so many cases. There were so many cases in my life where you know, I had always gone, oh, I must have misinterpreted the signals because she wasn't happy the next day. But now I realize I wasn't even listening, right? And I didn't realize that till I really read your book, and that's a gift in some. I mean, I guess it's a gift and a curse.
Well, you're welcome, and my apologies in that case. But it's really good to hear that. You know, it's funny because that wasn't even really an outcome I was imagining as I was writing the book, but it is so good to hear. And it makes a lot of sense too, you know, like the more I talk about these dynamics and the starker it becomes to me, our lack of preparation for being humans in this fucked up society. Like we just like, how are we supposed to know? Like you know, and it's funny because I think, you know, my book might read one way. Looking back at it, in most of the cases, even with the boys I'm writing about, I'm like, how the hell would they know? They were operating from these terrible models as well. Like none of us had a guide for any of it. And it's funny because also reading your book, and maybe this is like kind of corollary experience to what you just described, I had these moments of really profound sympathy for my dad, who was like, he's a great guy. He was super loving and really present and just unprepared to have an adolescent daughter. And like many fathers, I think, and I recognized it was so interesting to sort of, as I'm sure lots of readers will, sort of reading through these frameworks that you are sort of delineating and then deconstructing and sort of arguing with and offering this alternative, like much better model. I just could see all of the sort of like snapshots of my own childhood and could see exactly the ways that my own father was sort of doing the best he could with those models, right? And how confounding and painful it was for both of us when they failed, because we didn't know what else to do. You know, there wasn't an alternative. And I think in many ways it was easier for my mom because feminism was something she was already fluent in and knew how to access and how to interpret. And there's a million trillion books about mothering. But my dad was like, this is terrible, but the analogy that just came to mind is like, he was out to sea. Like he didn't have the tools, and he did an amazing job with what he was given, but there's just so little. And what there is so painfully dated, you know. It was really, it was just staggering to read about all of that in your book. And one of the things I wanted to say was also that, you know, two things actually. And one is sort of about what you were saying before about the difficulty of trying to get the tone right. And I just know that from the first few pages, I was like, oh, he worked really hard to get the tone right. And he did it. And that just like your reliance on and sort of the faithful way that you cite feminist thinkers and really engage in very sort of accessible but clearly thorough interactions with their work and ideology. But I think that the autobiographical parts of this are, you know, I think it was like Paul Valery or someone who said that all theory is autobiography. And for me, it's like, I'm not really interested in theory without some autobiography because I know it's in there. And so my favorite works combine those things. And I think particularly in a case like this, it is the autobiographical elements that qualify this narrator to instruct other fathers. Otherwise, like, who are you? You're some guy in a study with a bunch of books. You know what I mean? It's this patriarchal model of like, I'm going to tell you what to do and not expose anything. I'm just this disembodied patriarchal voice telling you what to do. And it's actually the memoir parts of the book that make it radical, that make it believable, that make it something I would want to read. So I just, you know, want to support you in that mission and to say that it was worth it, because I don't think it would be the book that it is, or that it would do the kind of work you want it to do without without your story in it. And it's just like so personable and honest, and it's really great. And the other thing is that I know as I was reading it, and I know this from my own work, it's really hard to sort of theorize and write about the process of changing your own mind and actively seeking out agents and resources and tools and strategies for changing your own mind. One, because it's super vulnerable. Two, because it happens as you're writing, like you're figuring it out and you have to go back and change things, and you know, you're learning as you're doing it. And so the book is really sort of a transcript of that process. And three, because you're going to change your mind again. And I'm sure that there are already things in this book that you've revised your thinking about or had further conversations, or like you said, you wish that you'd read my book beforehand. And there's so many books that I've read since I've published Girlhood where I'm like, shit, if I only had had this book when I was writing my book. And I just like, it's a practice of acceptance, of sort of letting that go. And all of this is to say that I think, like most successful ideological works, your book leaves room to change your mind and room for growth. Like that space is built into it. Like the humility of the book is that it basically acknowledges already, like, this is going to change. Like that's the whole idea, right? Is that you have to incorporate into your idea of successful masculinity, the humility of changing your mind for the rest of your life over and over and over again, of continuing to integrate new sources and ideas and to let go of the ones that aren't serving you or your kids anymore, you know? So, you know, like Buddhism has it, the 12 steps have it, like my favorite feminist theories all have it, and your book definitely has it too. So I guess I was also wondering sort of what conversations or ideas or other stuff have you read that has sort of interacted with your thinking and process with this book? And maybe it's too early to ask that question because it's only been in the world for like a couple weeks, but I'm going to ask anyway.
So you're asking about what you mean since, you know, I mean, the interesting thing is, you know, you finish writing a book, and during the process of writing, it's almost like you're seeking out specific ideas, right? You're after them. You're. And in fact, I have a question for you about this, but I'll answer yours first. For me, I have specific ideas I want to think about, and I'm sort of I'm searching for things and ideas and devouring them. And sometimes I go in really weird places because I start to think about something odd, and then I study it and learn the whole history of it. But it's all very object oriented, right? It's all there's an objective every, you know, I'm trying to finish this chapter. I'm trying to find the way to uncover this idea. And so something really interesting happens once it's all done, which is you start to read for fun again. and especially in this particular book, because I've been doing so many events with so many people like you that I end up reading all of their books, and that's not with nearly as much, you know, I have no goal at the end other than I want to make sure I know who I'm talking to. And you discover all these ideas and all these ways of thinking about things that you never would have come across, but are so deeply connected to your own work. And then sometimes I discover things where I'm like, whoa, I just read someone who used like 15 of the same exact quotes that I used in my book by pure coincidence. And that's always a fascinating thing. But the question I wanted to ask you, Melissa, is because you're talking about that thing that I think we both do, which is the integration of memoir, and I kind of don't even want to call it memoir. I want to call it confession, because in many times, you know, I think in both of our cases, they're pretty dark things. They're not the kinds of things that you sort of go, hey, I want to celebrate. These are the stories you kind of don't tell a lot. You know, almost every story in my book is a mistake. I remember my kids at one point, you know, because while I was researching, I constantly was sitting at the dinner table and I'd be like, misogyny, and call out about every word they said. They were like, so everybody's a misogynist, but you. I'm like, no, I am too. You should read my book. Every chapter starts with a story about my failing, and they were like totally blown away. They couldn't even imagine that. But my question for you, as you think about we take all these dark stories, we take all these stories of our, I'm trying not to use the word trauma. I think in some cases trauma fits for some of the stories you tell. I don't want to over victimize myself because again, I don't want to do the hold my balls while I cry thing. But you also integrate that memoir and confession with a lot of theory and a lot of ideas and a lot of literature. And I guess I was curious as I was rereading some of it this morning, like, what's your process? Like, what comes first? Like, do you know what you're writing about first, or do you start with a memory and then you discover the theme, or yeah?
I usually start with the memory, with the confession, and I know that there are people who do this in the inverse, but for me, and it's funny, I love that you're calling it confession too. I just finished writing this like gargantuanly long essay that actually compares the process of writing memoir with the sort of spiritual processes of confession. So I'm all about it. I want to reclaim the adjective confessional too, which sometimes has a like judgy connotation. Anyway, I usually start with the confessional elements because for me, that's where the itch is, right? Or at least I've been doing it long enough that it's pretty far up on the surface at this point. So, and for me, I know it's always important for me that my writing be pleasurable. Like I want it to be fun to read. Like I like engrossing reading. I'm not really interested in reading theory without something juicy to a spoonful of juicy sugar to go with it. So I often use my own experience and history and sort of confessional elements as the kind of structural spine of the essay. So what I'll often do is sort of, I always go for like the hardest memories first, and the things that I'm like most afraid of saying aloud, those are the things that I have the strongest drive to want to write down too. Because it's like secrets, right? They build up a kind of momentum in us where they want to explode out. And sometimes that happens in oblique, destructive kinds of ways. And writing is an act of sublimation for me. So I'll often start with the sort of hardest part, and then I'll work my way out from there and get kind of like an outline of what I think the sort of personal narrative is going to be. And then I go to the books and I go to the databases and I start talking to my friends, and I just like, it's like a massive brainstorm where I'm like reading and highlighting and talking about it in Wikipedia rabbit holes and watching YouTube videos, you know what I mean? And I sort of like cull everything and am just kind of immersed in it for a while. And then of course it's like some sliver of all of that ends up in the final essay. But I get that sense reading your book too, where it's just like you said, where it's like, you have to get a really concise, well integrated sort of bit of research or a citation. I know how much research goes into it's really the tip of the iceberg, so I assume you have, and you have a really robust bibliography here too. So I imagine you did a lot of reading and researching and thinking just to sort of boil it down to the little bits that made it into the book. And I know that you also like teach philosophy, and I just wondered, and you have like etymology and some Greek stuff, and it's sort of it's a really straightforward book in many ways, but your research is pretty far-flung and wide-ranging, and it's clear to me at least that your background is not like a child psychologist or just a dad reading books, and so I wonder if there are like, I wondered as I was reading, and maybe this is a real question, if there are sort of shadow books or projects or tangents where you wanted to sort of go. Are there a bunch of like, is there a scholarly manuscript that sort of bounced off of this and you have to repot somewhere else? Because I imagine it gets like other wheels and gears in your brain and your background turning that didn't quite fit the objectives of this book.
I think if there's anything, it's not it's not scholarly. It's some weird avant-garde word poem.
Even better, way better.
I mean, and you're right. There's so much that goes in. There's so much that's cut. I think somewhere there's a 5,000 word chapter that I cut that was just the history of eunuchs. Because I had this artistic idea that somewhere towards the end I had to deal with the question of emasculation and men who think they're getting emasculated, and what better sort of subtle way to sneak into that than to actually deal with like literal castration. And so yeah. I have all that somewhere. It just as you said, the goal is to make a book that's pleasurable to read. I like to think of a book as a kind of companion that you spend a week with or 2 weeks with, and I want it to feel like that. Often when I'm writing, whenever I'm writing, the only thing I'll read for pleasure is fiction, because I want to be in that space of sort of being accompanied by characters and words, and know what that feels like, so that I can try to offer that to readers. Because that's to me, that's the pleasure of reading, and that's the pleasure of learning. I think that's the space from which we find ideas that lead us to interrogate ourselves and change the ways we think about the world. And of course, that's ultimately, I think every writer's goal is to help people, maybe not change, but at least consider other ways of thinking about the world.
I don't know if that's every writer's goal, but I think it's both of our goal and a lot of writers' goals. And also, if you want to write another book that sort of interrogates and investigates and articulates masculinity through lyric word poems, I will read that shit in a heartbeat. So I'm interested in do not stuff your chapter on eunuchs away in a drawer, because
I'll make it. I promise you I'll find some place to publish it in at least some form at some point.
I look forward to that. Wait, so this is an unrelated question, and I think probably I just want to encourage folks to put questions in the chat, because we should probably turn to that soon. Yeah. But you said that you mostly read fiction for pleasure. And so I am like headed into a summer where I haven't read anything for pleasure. Even like last summer was crazy, and it was a bananas year publishing a book. So I haven't like read anything strictly for pleasure. And I also read almost exclusively novels for pleasure, maybe a juicy memoir, but so I'm interested in what you have waiting on your nightstand for when you're done with all the book tour and all of that.
Oh, well, the thing that I'm reading right now, that I'm about halfway through, is the final revival of Opal and Nev. Is that what it's called? Do you know this book? It's a fictional history of, I guess it's supposed to be a 1960s rock band that with an African-American woman as the singer and this British guy as is the songwriter or something, and it's all about how they find themselves in I'm trying to not give any of it away while I tell it, but it's all these questions about fame and pop culture and race and history and memory and nostalgia and I don't know. It's very immersive. I'm not done it, so I can't tell you how good I think it is.
Well, wait, what's it called? It sounds amazing.
I think it's the final revival of Opal and Nev. Is that? I don't know. I'm looking at Susan because she's the bookseller. So
the final revival of Opal and Nev. Cool.
Yeah,
that's enough to find it.
You'll certainly find it. It's pretty. I think it came out a couple weeks ago, but it was. Yeah, it's a good book so far.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I love like a big juicy novel that's like super page turning, but also like deep and gorgeously written. And I like really sort of top tier high quality mysteries too. So I'm looking forward to some pleasure reading this summer for sure.
So should we take some questions?
Yeah, let's do it. It looks like Alan has a question. When it comes to the integration of memoir with theory, feminist theory in particular, what authors have influenced you? I will say, and I know that these people are in your book, but Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, Bell Hooks for sure. I think reading, like, I read Teaching to Transgress might have been the first Bell Hooks book that I read. And that book, I think, gets thought of as like a pedagogy book in many ways, but it's a total sort of auto theory, memoir, pedagogy, like radical treatise. Like, it is super hybrid and beautifully written and super page turning. And I would say also a lot of Audre Lorde too. Like, Zami was really big for me in my 20s and has remained so. And in fact, it's like all of my favorite feminist thinkers are using elements of memoir in their work. Maybe not all, but most of them, you know. Like, that's what I'm interested in. I'm nosy and I want to know how people came to it. And it's almost always through experience that people come to good ideas. I don't really trust your ideas if they haven't come from your own experience. What about you, Jordan?
I mean, I have to agree with you. I mean, one, I have to agree with you on Teaching to Transgress, which I actually read. I pull off my shelf before every semester that I teach in the university. I think of it like just like aerobics, like I have to exercise, and it just makes me think a bit about how to. Sometimes I just read one essay, but it gets me ready for the classroom. But I absolutely Bell Hooks. I mean, in all of Bell Hooks' books, I would say there was a time when I could have said I've read them all. She writes a lot, so there's some new ones I haven't read yet. But in all of them, pretty much every essay, every chapter starts with a personal story about, and often they're about growing up. Often they're about her own experience with inequality, and she just does it so beautifully, and then is such serious theory after that. I mean, and that's important because I mean, there's a million books you can pick up off the shelf any day that are doing memoir with sort of pop theory, but you know, anytime anyone says to me the mix of memoir and theory, I think I learned it reading Bell Hooks. I mean, that's where that was the inspiration for me. She's certainly one of my biggest inspirations. Absolutely, as a feminist, but and as an activist, but also as a writer.
Yeah, me too. I think it was just baked in, like, from an early conception of like what was possible. For sure. Amanda wants to know, who are the other feminist men? Why aren't there more? I mean, there are some.
I mean, there are certainly some out there. Most of them are writing in a much more academic way than I'm writing. There's one that was a professor of mine named Gary Lemons, who I'm doing an event with in a couple of weeks. But no, there aren't many men who are willing to at least brand themselves as feminist in a really positive way. And I think that's part of why I make the joke about the all the men's books that are about, you know, vulnerable feelings, and is that I feel like that there's an unwillingness to take it the step it needs to go, right? It's almost like those books start out fine, and I read them all while writing Father Figure. They, you know, like here I happen to have Iron John, the famous one, right in front of me, right? It starts out fine with here's the real problem and the struggle that men have in culture and patriarchy, and here's the difficulty, but they're not willing to take it to the, you know, they're not willing to do it. And that's why I put the word feminist in such big letters on the cover of this book, because I wanted it to be provocative, and I wanted to say, hey, it's time already. Like, enough. Well,
I mean, I really appreciate that about this book too, because I think part of it also is that there are men who are engaged and interested and really earnestly want to know how to be right, right, how to be good, how to like be a good man, and are even sort of manifesting that in their lives, but that they think it's not for them, or that they're going to get in trouble if they claim it, or, you know, and I think, I don't know, like there is, like, surely I know that there are lots of men who are obviously benefiting from patriarchy, and so they're just not interested in gender parity or anything like that. But I also think that there are lots of men who don't know if it's okay to call themselves feminists. Like, is that appropriative, you know? And
Yeah.
I think it just takes more men doing it and modeling that. And I think part of it also is like, and this is something that can be sort of applied to like a lot of different sort of conversations like this, where when there's room, like there is room made in the identity of feminists for people to make mistakes and to be teachable, then suddenly it becomes more possible to be like, hey, I'm a feminist. Help me figure out what that means. I'm going to try it. I'm going to listen, and I'm going to try to live this. And if I screw up, that's going to be part of my learning process. You know, like, I think people are just really scared to do that, you know? And I think I know some men who would be afraid to claim the word, you know? But it will do us all a lot of good if they start feeling more comfortable. So I'm really glad that you have it in such big lettering on the cover of your book, you know? And are also, you know, speaking from a position that will be easier for some men to read, or more likely for them to pick up and learn what feminism is, and that it's not just for women by women, you know, and that it actually is a much more capacious ideology that includes elements of like, you know, deconstructing the gender binary, but also anti-racist. Like, you know, this is a book about sort of living activism and social justice. It's not, and you know, feminism is a word, and all of the feminist thinkers and writers that we're both citing describe it that way, right? Like it's a really, really big umbrella, you know? And I think a lot of men see it and they think feminist, female, that's not for me. That's against.
And to be clear, none of the feminist thinkers that we're quoting or mentioning think that it's a battle. It's a battle for women to conquer men. None of them are trying to cancel it.
Yeah.
And so, any men watching, this is not that's not what it's about.
That's right. That's right. Maybe we'll take one more. What advice do you have for someone starting out on writing their memoir? Do you want to start with that?
What advice do I have? Keep trying. It's you know, it's really, 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 really hard. I know I already said that once, but writing is really, really hard. When I wrote The New Childhood, I took a semester off from teaching. And I did that with this idea that I needed like 8 hours a day to concentrate on writing. And I would sit down in the morning and try to write. And I don't know about you, but I can only write 2 to 3 hours a day before, you know, sometimes I'm lucky. I get a day where I can like really, you know, nonstop, but most of the time, like I'm lucky if it's 3. It's 2 hours of really good work. And so what happened that semester was I actually felt horrible about myself, because I would start every morning, I get 2 hours, and I just feel like I was a lazy bum when I would watch TV or go for a walk and couldn't. And so I didn't do that for this book. I taught straight through writing it because I discovered, you know, it's easy for me to find the 2 hours to do it, but don't kid yourself into thinking there is more. There is more to do that. And again, you know, I guess I could write bad words all day long if I needed to, but it takes a long time. I mean, every sentence for me, and I'm imagining for you too, Melissa, from reading your book, every sentence for me is a unbelievable struggle. And you know, I remember I finished writing the book, my mom said something to me like, well, you love writing. I'm like, I don't know if I love the writing part of writing. I love being a writer. I love reading the thing I wrote.
Yeah,
I love coming up with the right sentence.
Mark Twain who said, I don't like writing, I like having written. Right?
Yes, totally.
Yeah. And you know, I would say all of that's true. You know, sometimes it does come easy. Sometimes it's a total joy, but I am not the person to judge the success of the product, not for a while anyway, because some of it is just desperately, grievously hard won, a lot of it. And then some days I feel like I'm flying, and sometimes that I end up cutting that stuff, and sometimes that's the best stuff. I think for me, it's just showing up and just not stopping, even when it feels gross and hard and I'm riddled with insecurity and it feels like it's going to take forever, and it is taking forever. It's just, if it feels bad and hard, it doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. That's just what writing a book feels like some of the time. And I would also say to just like, for me, writing memoir is a really careful sort of dance between rigor and really showing up for the work and being tenacious about it, and also being gentle and generous and listening to myself and not listening to my psyche when it says, I need some distance from this, I need a break, let's circle back, or I got to take a few months off to just talk about this in therapy so that I know what to say next or feel like I can face it. And I think it's just staying engaged at whatever level feels possible at a given moment. And it's impossible to see the forest for the trees, but for me, regardless of what happens in the publication life of the book, that process has always been unbelievably valuable and transformative for me. Yeah.
Well, I think it's probably about time to wrap up. Do you want to do a wrap up, Susan?
Oh. Well, I did have one question, Jordan.
Yeah.
Since we can't even identify more than one feminist male writer, what was your road to publication? I mean, was there a bidding war? Was it easy to get representation? I mean, who wanted your book? Who didn't?
So I will say, I did my previous book with Little Brown also, and so when I presented it, and the editor that I worked there with at Little Brown immediately liked the idea and was unbelievably supportive. So, but I am, it's sort of a great question, because at the same time, there were a million conversations among all of us and marketing people. On one side, one part of a book is this sort of pure pleasure of what do you want to say and the struggle of saying it. And then the other side is you still have to think about the marketing question. And I can't tell you how many times we had to sit and go, wait, who's going to buy this? Men don't really buy books. And that's just statistics, right? That like 80% of books are bought by women. And so that was a really hard question I kept having to deal with. And so I'm grateful that Little Brown took it right away, because I imagine it would have been really hard. And it certainly, I don't think any other editor would have had the faith in me to go through the whole process of the avant-garde word poems, going from that to this. But yeah, I have heard from other people, like Liz Plank did a book about men, and says she had a real struggle trying to find people who believed it would work. I'm grateful. I just have a really supportive team at Little Brown, and Little Brown tends to be pretty good on feminist issues anyway. So I think they immediately saw the benefit of this to the world. But we still are wondering, are men going to be willing to pick up are men going to be willing to hold a book that says feminist on the cover while they're sitting in public? And right. I sincerely hope so, but I recognize that maybe not.
Yeah, I hope so too. That's a great question. I just want to thank you again, Jordan. I feel like we are going to have to keep having this conversation over the course of many years, so we should just be pals.
Yeah.
And Susan, I want to thank you for running a feminist bookstore. You are a saint, and I'm so glad that Woman Books has stayed standing through the pandemic. And I'm super excited the next time I'm in Austin to come by and give you a hug.
we've got an open door for both of you. We would
Thank
love
you.
to see you in person. And then I have one follow-up question. How many men are on the call?